significant chunks of their statistical data since the war started with Ukraine on February 24th last year. What impact do you think this additional lack of transparency is having on the market, both in Russia and globally?
Surprisingly, this impact so far was quite limited. Despite the strictest sanctions ever imposed on Russian oil and gas sector and on the Russian financial system, actually the volumes of oil production and oil exports were pretty stable until the end of November 2022. And the industry was performing quite well. It was actually exceeding the volumes of 2021. Russian oil output grew by 2%. Export volumes were basically at the same level as before the war. So resilience of the Russian oil sector is really surprising. In December, the oil embargo was imposed by the EU and oil price cap imposed by the G7 countries. And that started to influence the situation. In mid-December, Russian oil exports went down. We do not have any precise statistics yet, but it's pretty clear that December and beginning of this year will show decline both in Russian oil output and in exports. The key question is for how long, whether it will bounce back, as it did actually in April and March when the sanctions were imposed. And first, Russian oil performance went down, but then it actually recovered quite quickly as Russia was rebuilding its logistics, looking for the different bypassing routes, finding new intermediaries and different gray schemes how to sustain its export volumes. And given that Russian oil companies are really very smart and adaptive, they did it pretty well. So I would expect that early in 2023, we will see further decline. Actually, Russian Deputy Prime Minister Novak says about 5 to 700,000 barrels per day loss in Russian oil production and exports. But then there is quite high probability that slowly, using the shadow fleet, using different bypassing schemes, Russia will find the way to rebuild its export volumes, diversifying its routes and ways of supplies.
So
But
almost
at the same
a
time,
2.0, isn't it? Because you're saying about diversifying its routes and finding new ways to bounce back. And it's done that in 2022 as the West rolled out quicker than some anticipated in some cases. Actor in the East started rolling in. And as you say, despite its 2 million barrels a day drop earlier on the year as shipments to Europe, the US, Japan, Korea started being pulled back, rerouting of flows to India, China, Turkey, and others meant that even at the end of August, it was just down by nearly 400,000 barrels a day, which is astonishing compared to that level of decline versus pre-war levels, if you consider the level of disruption. And as you phrased, the strictest sanctions ever placed on this energy giant. So what are your thoughts on the speed of Russia's pivot? Because you mentioned there about the adaptability, and you mentioned there about their ability to diversify. Do you think that they can pull the rabbit out the hat again in 2023 as well as they did in 2022?
That's a big question mark, and it will also depend on the situation in the global oil market. What will happen with the oil demand and what will happen with the oil prices? Nobody knows the exact answer. But actually, during 2022, Russia managed to redirect its export volumes considerably. Last February, 70% of Russian seaborne crude exports were delivered to the EU and UK. And China, together with Turkey and India, represented just 20% of Russian seaborne crude supplies. But already in December, India became the largest market for Russian seaborne crude, representing 42%, 42% from nearly zero. And another 25% are going to China. So that is really amazing change of flows. The question is whether China and India and Turkey, to a certain extent, will be ready to absorb additional volumes of Russian crude. There are technical restrictions, whether refineries are able to process these grades of crude, but also the questions of energy security. At least China is always very cautious on regarding increased dependency on any single supplier. And then another factor which will start to work in February is ban on Russian petroleum products imposed by the EU, and also price cap on the petroleum products. It is unprecedented measure, and frankly, nobody knows how exactly it will work and how it will affect the flows of Russian petroleum products, but also the global picture.
That does certainly suggest that the bounce or the height of the bounce in 2023 is not going to be what we saw in 2022. Like you say, it was surprising that they were so resilient. I think a lot of people in the market expected them to show some kind of resilience. This isn't a new problem geopolitically for them, and that there would be backups in place. But the level of resilience was really surprising. But end of last year, beginning to see a tick down, as you say, up to 700,000 barrels a day, lower perhaps early this year. And then as we move in the year, there are further restrictions being placed upon it. So it's probably, would you say it's fair to say, I mean, it's hard to, like you say, you don't know about oil prices, you don't know about the wider geopolitical situation even. Do you think that the fact that there isn't good visibility on what Russia is doing, do you think that will start to bite more as the year progresses? Do you think
Yes.
Yeah, you do.
Yes, exactly. And that's the way how sanctions work normally. They do not provide an immediate effect. They are slowly reducing the ability to develop, to expand. And so I think by the end of 2023, Russian oil output will be probably 15% less than before the war. Russian crude oil exports will also reduce, maybe up to 20%. So it will be felt, it will be seen, but it will not happen overnight. And even with these levels, Russian economy will still feel quite okay, and Russian oil industry will not collapse. It is not needed actually to shut down huge fields. It's sufficient just to stop drilling the new wells. So it's not a catastrophe. It's unpleasant for the industry, obviously. It's reducing the revenues of the oil companies. And most importantly, it is reducing the revenues of the Russian budget. But it is not the end of the Russian energy sector and of the Russian economy. It is extremely resilient and well positioned to survive even under very strong sanctions.
Do you think that the lack of visibility on the data side will start to affect relationships with its newer partners, such as India and China? Do you think as 2023 progresses that they'll start to have a greater appetite to get more visibility on what Russia's doing for their forecasting, for their supply-demand dynamics, for their geopolitical pressure as well on those countries, and their engagement with Russia? Do you think they'll start looking to Moscow going, you have to give us a little bit more transparency, a little bit more clarity?
Yes, it's extremely difficult to make any planning, especially strategic planning in the situation of the restricted data access. But I think these countries have different routes how to obtain this data through BRICS, through the other unions which exist on Eurasia space. So there will be, I assume, some additional channels for data exchange, and they will provide sufficient information, especially understanding that Russia needs China and India much more in this situation when it's becoming more and more isolated and dependent on these countries.
You mentioned there as well about the resilience of the economy, and that this is a big bruise, but this certainly isn't going to crush any facet of that. And we're seeing already strains to parts of its currency reserves are frozen, access to international financing is limited, international payment transactions are difficult. The government defaulted on external debt for the first time in decades last year, and recent forecasts anticipate up to an 8% drop in Russian GDP for 2022 to 2023. So that's quite a strained outlook. Even against that outlook, how do you think the revenues from fossil fuels will feed into that? You still think it's very much a case of being bruised, but life does go on, or will there need to be changes further than just not exploring new fields? Will it have impact?
Mhm. On one hand, there is indeed this decline in GDP and in oil and gas revenues. We can observe it even from the statistics that is still available. But 3% GDP loss in 2022 doesn't sound like the end of the world. Even in 2020, when pandemic, the first wave of pandemic happened, it was 5% GDP loss. So it is still not that dramatic.
I think sorry, Tatiana, some forecasts are saying up to 8%. So on the back of COVID as well, you got the 5% from COVID, you got potentially 8% this year. That's 3%, as you say, isn't as steep.
3% in 2022. Russian authorities are talking about like 2% loss in 2023. I think they are over optimistic. Maybe it will be 4-5%, but again, it's not a big drama. Regarding oil and gas revenues, as I said, they are decreasing starting from May. They actually peaked in April at unprecedented heights. But since then they are slowly declining, but they are still higher than in 2021 and much higher than in 2020. So there is this trend. The sanctions are working, but as I said, they are working very slowly. The problem for Russian budget is that this slow loss of the oil and gas revenues is accompanied by a dramatic growth of military expenditures. And altogether, it is definitely increasing Russian budget deficit, and Russian authorities are already clearly talking about it. They are, in their turn, increasing tax pressure on the oil and gas companies, which is limiting their further ability to invest. And they are reducing the expenditures for social needs, for education, for healthcare, which obviously doesn't help sustainability of the economy.
No.
But these processes, they are rather slow, and I think it's not realistic to expect that Russia will stop the war or Russian economy will collapse because of these sanctions. There are other factors, the satisfaction of the population with the war and the general disorder of the system. But this economic side, it will slowly reduce Russian ability to develop, but it will not change the situation quickly.
It's more of a slow squeeze, isn't it? And even at that point, the resilience is so strong that it's like you say, from that point alone, that leg of the chair, as it were, alone is not. If you break that, the chair is still going to stand upright. You were saying there about a limited investment, and how does that feed into their greener energy plans and their plans for more energy efficiency and their plans to improve the efficiency of their existing operations as well? How do you see that moving forward for the coming year? Do you think all plans are off for now?
It's quite funny to observe contradictory statements that Russian authorities are making. On one hand, right after the sanctions were imposed, most of the environmental constraints were simply frozen or removed. You can flare associated petroleum gas. Forget about methane emissions. Russia has even introduced Euro 0 fuel standard. I didn't even know that such standard exists for the car makers. So environment and emission reductions are definitely not on the priority list in the operational activities of the government and of the companies, but still the Ministry of Economic Development and other authorities, they keep repeating that Russia is still thinking about this net zero target by 2060. It will nevertheless develop hydrogen economy and hydrogen project, probably to in lower scale, but it is absolutely devoted to this idea. There will be renewables development. These statements go together with the reduction of funding for renewables. Yeah, so it's really difficult to predict how exactly it will play out. I think some of the rhetorics will remain in place because it is important for Russia to keep its allies, especially in non-OECD Asia, and to demonstrate that it is leading some developments, especially related to hydrogen and CCUS. But I don't think, frankly, that as the time is going, that this will result in real improvements or real large-scale projects.
And the fact that it's gone from nearly zero in India to 42% in approximately 10 months is astonishing. And it certainly speaks to the speed of Moscow's pivot and ability to pivot. But like I say, we've talked about so many points, but what for you really stands out for the coming year? What do you think is at the top of the list to keep an eye on?
So first of all, the petroleum products ban and price cap, it will have a spill-out effect on the whole global market, and it's really extremely difficult to predict how exactly it will work. For Russia, it will most likely result in up to 10% reduction of the refining capacity. So it will be felt in the domestic market, and it will affect the oil companies' balance sheets, obviously. Oil and gas revenues will further decrease, most likely, and as I said, it will be a slow process. With gas, I think as Russia has reduced its gas exports to Europe in 2022 by 80%, 80, it's unbelievable. Yeah, I don't see, frankly, any opportunities to restore these volumes in 2023. Right now, gas keeps flowing to Europe only through Ukraine. Surprise, surprise. And given this massive bombing of the Ukrainian infrastructure and the whole military action ongoing, obviously this transit is challenged just physically. The second route is through Turkey, and it is basically utilized at full capacity. So there is no upside for Russia to increase supplies to Europe. The question is whether it will go down because of military actions. But I think Russia will put a lot of efforts to speed up this idea of Turkish gas hub and to try to restore its participation in the European market under the auspice of Turkey. It's a new game which Russia is playing right now in Central Asia, in Azerbaijan, with Iran, with Turkey. So we can see already some signs of new alliance evolving in the center of Eurasia. And Russia will definitely try not only to benefit in terms of gas exports, but also to build up its geopolitical influence in the region. Because energy during this whole war, it is obviously part of much bigger geopolitical game. And you've mentioned all these alliances that Russia is trying to establish all over the world, in South America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, basically everywhere. And I think it will be the key trend of 2023, proposing huge discounts, which these countries need badly, proposing even investments, nuclear power plant construction, some technologies which Russia has already, even investments, in order to unify all these countries, which are actually still suffering economically after the COVID pandemic.
I'm still going through it as well.
Yeah. So they are dissatisfied with the current global order. They are dissatisfied with the economics. And in this respect, it's not like the Soviet bloc was. but some sort of this idea, all the countries which are not supporting the West. So that's the key geopolitical driver for Russia. And it should be kept in mind that all these energy alliances or energy projects which Russia is trying to initiate, they are part of much bigger picture. And in this respect, I would suggest to follow very closely all these state visits, all these agreements which will be signed, and new investments which will be announced, because actually they will reflect the bigger geopolitical moves.
Do you think that we'll see responses from the West with these countries? So, okay, this is obviously the crude simplification, but Moscow's visited, we've offered X. UK will visit, we'll offer X, and we'll start seeing there's always been underlying tug of war for all these sorts of potential contracts, but we'll start seeing a far more competitive tug of war going on between Russia and the West for these deals.
Yes, of course, it's inevitable, but I think the West still doesn't realize at full extent the scale of this war that Russia is engaged in. For the West, it's regional war between Russia and Ukraine. For Russia, it's global hybrid war between Russia and collective West. Yeah. And so similarly to the USSR, which was actually leading this global hybrid war, Cold War, back in 1960s, 1970s, all over the world, sabotage of infrastructure, financing political parties opposing to the government, financing all the movements are destabilizing the situation. I think we will see a lot of that because secret services in Russia are still extremely efficient. And I think you've all heard many interesting stories about that. And though the army, the Russian army, doesn't demonstrate amazing success in Ukraine, these special services, they have a lot of capabilities still, and this is probably the last way how to affect the situation. So I would call all the energy companies to be extremely cautious in terms of protecting their infrastructure and looking after their plants, their ships, and so on. Nord Stream was not just a sudden accident. It's illustrating, unfortunately, much bigger trend. And this is really the war which is affecting the whole world.
Tatiana, unfortunately, we have to wrap up there. And I mean, unfortunately, because I would love to talk about this so much longer and go into the different alliances and which ones would prove most fruitful, which ones the West might have a chance of recouping. And there's so much to say here. But thank you very, very much. You've given us a comprehensive and brilliant overview of what we can try to expect this year, and a few warnings for companies as well that very much hope are heeded. So Tatiana, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much. Great question.
Thank you.